problems we face. On the one hand, I am a libertarian, and if I could wave a magic wand and make society however I wanted it, I would say leave the money where it begins and watch the ways that it is used to solve problems much more effectively than the government will. That dog won't hunt, and I understand that. But I also sympathize with the position of the left, which says people are born with the short end of the stick. That's not their fault. That makes it much more difficult for them to compete with economic success in a global economy, and that in a country as rich as the United States, everyone should have access to a decent standard of living. I find that very hard to argue with as a practical matter, no matter how much I might think philosophically that there's a better way to do business. On the other hand, I remain committed to the idea that a successful life means much more than a decent standard of living. That the deep satisfactions of life, I'm going to come back to this topic later in the presentation, the deep satisfactions in life come from making a life. And that making a life involves being able incrementally to make mistakes, to learn from those mistakes, and over a period of time with many false starts, to find a valued place in your business, in your profession, in your job of any kind, in your community, and in your family. And the catch in all of this is that to do so requires both the freedom to act and responsibility for the consequences of action. You can't do it any other way. And so I remain committed to the idea that when people of my belief say you've got to maximize freedom and responsibility, we also have hold of the truth. The plan I present in our hands represents a way to say, let's make a deal. We of the right will agree to generous support of people with low incomes. And you on the left, we ask you to let us give this support without the apparatus of the welfare state. The plan itself is real simple. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the technical details of it. We can talk about those in the questioning period. I will lay out the structure, and then I'm sure you will think of many of the questions to ask about those technical details. The plan goes like this. You take all of the money we currently spend on transfers. That means all the big-ticket items like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, you name it. It includes all of those programs that are in that statistical abstract table called programs for support of people with low incomes or something to that effect. That means all welfare programs of any kind. It also means, by the way, all corporate welfare. It also means agricultural subsidies, things like that. Transfer payments go. We have, I assume, the same revenue stream. I don't do anything with the tax system at all. I just say, one way or another, we will generate the same amount of revenue. But what we will do with all these transfer payments is that we will take them to Washington and we will redistribute them to the population, all American adults age 21 and older who are American citizens and not incarcerated get $10,000 a year. It's deposited electronically, monthly, in a known bank account. No bank account, no grant. A detail, by the way, which has a variety of consequences we can talk about later. There is a payback, but it's a very high payback point. So if you are a low-income person and you go to work at a job, you do not immediately have the amount of your grant reduced by a surtax. You keep everything you make up to $25,000 of earned income. So at that point, you have a net of $35,000. And then you start to pay a surtax, which maxes out at $50,000. So at $50,000, you have a net of $5,000. Everyone gets this regardless of the income of other people with whom they are living, whether they are married or not. So as people are fond of saying or asking me, you mean that the wife of Bill Gates gets $10,000 a year? And the answer is yes, she does, if she doesn't hold a paid job. We're making more than $25,000. That is one other detail. I was reluctantly, for I wanted to leave this just as free as possible for people to spend exactly as they saw fit. I was reluctantly forced to the conclusion that $3,000 a year has to be earmarked for medical care. I would argue that that figure with some reforms that I present in the book, would provide for quite generous medical care. Without the reforms, it would provide a pretty stripped-down package. But you have to earmark, again, for reasons we can talk about in the questioning period, you have to earmark that much for medical care. As for whether you have to earmark any more money for retirement, I prefer not to. If someone wanted to say, we're going to require people to put $2,000 a year into some sort of retirement fund, and if that's what would bring you around to supporting the plan, I would sigh heavily and say, okay, we can do it that way. And in fact, the calculations in the book, where I'm talking about the effects on poverty and on other outcomes, assume that you have a net of $5,000 that you can use for things other than retirement and medical care. So that's the plan. It would have a few very direct, immediate effects, which are not trivial. For one thing, it would end involuntary poverty. By involuntary poverty, I mean the poverty that occurs when people are trying hard, doing everything right, and are still poor. This does not mean that some people will not continue to live in squalor, because some people will choose ways to spend their money which leave them there. But it enables a wide variety, very wide variety of people with a very wide variety of circumstances to stay well above the poverty line. The obvious example is if somebody is working at a minimum wage job, and nobody stays at the minimum wage very long if they stay in the labor market, but we'll assume minimum wage, and let's say they're laid off 6 months out of the year. They're still well above the poverty line. A couple, one person with a minimum wage job working full-time brings home about $10,000 a year. Let's say that it's a couple, they're married, and the woman does not work at all. That's a net of $30,000, way above the poverty line. Or suppose that people are unable or don't want to work at all. Well, if you get 5 people together who don't want to work at all, that's $50,000. 5 people with $50,000 can live at a standard of living that's way above the poverty line. And in fact, you can even use the European definition of poverty, which is half the median income. You can still demonstrate it is really easy to stay above poverty, even defined that way. The second effect is that indeed it would provide medical care to everybody, universal. Third set of immediate effects are harder to pin down. They involve the people that I refer to as the underclass. I suppose I should define that term. By underclass, I don't mean people who are just poor. I mean people who do not participate in mainstream society. The most obvious way to not participate in mainstream society is to be a chronic criminal. But I also classify in this people who are young, able-bodied, particularly males, and are nonetheless not even in the labor force, not even looking for work. And I also classify, and this is the kind of thing which gets me in trouble with audiences like this, I also classify low-income young women with children and no fathers to be likely members of the underclass, even though we're not talking about binary yes-no classifications in this case. Here, I think that spinning out the effects of the plan get especially interesting. And they get especially interesting because we're talking about expectations that can be made of people who have an income stream that cannot be made of people who do not have an income stream. I call it the Dolittle Effect. Remember My Fair Lady? Alfred Dolittle, a good member of the underclass, didn't bother to marry the mother of Eliza Dolittle. He is frequently and happily unemployed. And then Henry Higgins recommends him to an American philanthropist as being the most original moralist in England, and he receives a large bequest. And as he then points out with great bitterness to Eliza, he now has 50 relatives he never knew he had before and not a decent income among them. And worst of all, his longtime girlfriend is now demanding to be married, and that's why he has to get to the church on time. Well, the same thing is going to play out in some form in communities in America. Let's take the young man who is living with his girlfriend and not contributing anything to that arrangement. And he can't, it's too bad, can't find a job. The only jobs that are available are for chump change. They're beneath his dignity. And so he's living with her. Now, he may not actually enjoy living with her that much, but it's a lot cheaper than not living with her. All at once he has an income stream. The girlfriend knows he has an income stream. Expectations can be laid on him that could not be laid on him before, with interesting secondary and tertiary effects. And I will simply mention the most obvious of all effects. A young man who fathers a child and does not want to support it, who now can disappear and not be found or have no visible income, now has a known income stream going into a known bank account that a judge can tap with a simple court order every single month. And every boy aged 19 years old will be looking at older brothers or older friends aged 21, 22, 23, some of whom are spending their money for further education or for things they want to spend their money on, and others of whom are having a substantial portion of that grant earmarked for care of a child they have sired. That is what I think they call an incentive effect. There will be other incentive effects that have to be considered in the plan, and that the most important involve work disincentives. A very serious issue with any kind of income support plan. A problem that sank the Sime-Dime experiences of the Sime-Dime experiment for the negative income tax in the 1970s. I try to deal with that with two buffers. The first is the buffer of a high payback point. If you are not paying back anything from the grant until $25,000 of earned income, that means, in effect, you have been lured into working until you can't afford to quit. Very few people will trade a $35,000 income for a $10,000 income. There will be effects on work effort in terms of hours worked, but the effects on holding a job versus not holding a job are minimized by this. A second buffer is the age at which you graduate from high school and the age at which the grant begins. I deliberately make it 21 years old, not 18 years old. I want people thrown out on their own for 3 years. The average high school graduate who goes to work immediately after graduation is making $20,000 by the time he's 21. So that once again you have a situation in which people become accustomed to working and enjoy working, and plus they have income to lose.